Welcome to this episode of the Australian Naval History podcast series, where we examine important events and aspects of the Royal Australian Navy's history. Hello, I'm Professor Rob McLaughlin, a former naval officer and Director of the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict and Society at the University of New South Wales campus at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. This series is produced by the Naval Studies Group at the University of New South Wales, supported by the Royal Australian Navy's Sea Power Centre, the Australian Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society of Australia, and the Submarine Institute of Australia. In this episode, we will discuss the exploits of the submarine HMAS AE-2 in World War I. In two previous episodes of Australian naval history, we have discussed the 1914 loss and the 2018 relocation of her sister ship, HMAS AE-1. To discuss this story, I'm joined by Mrs Elizabeth Bletchley, who with her husband Fred wrote Stoker's Submarine, which vividly describes the exploits of HMAS AE-2 and her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Henry Stoker. Rear Admiral Peter Briggs, a distinguished retired submariner, who among his many achievements led the successful search for HMAS AE-1. And Commander Greg Swinden, who now in a civilian capacity is a naval historian at the Sea Power Centre Australia. Greg co-authored the book First In, Last Out, which describes the REM's contribution to the Gallipoli campaign. Thank you all for joining me. So first off, Peter Briggs, can you describe for us HMAS AE-2?
Yes, at the time it was the state of the art, the most modern of the British submarines, and it was their main submarine in World War I. 800 tonnes, 2 diesel engines, which drove the propellers directly on the surface. Dived, it had 2 electric motors and banks of batteries to drive it, but a very limited range, about 45 nautical miles, so not a long range once the submarine was dived. It had 2 periscopes, which are critical to the navigation, penetrating the Dardanelles, a magnetic and a gyro compass to sense its direction. The gyro was very important because the magnetic was not that reliable as a source. No sonars that we would understand today, no radars, so it was very, very dependent on what the captain of the submarine could see through his periscope to navigate. Maximum diving depth of 100 feet, although AE-2 exceeded that on a number of occasions. 8 torpedoes carried 4 torpedo tubes and a reload for each. These are straight running torpedoes with a range of about 1,000 metres, designed to obviously operate against surface ships.
Elizabeth Bletchley, as we mentioned, her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Henry Stoker. What can you tell us about him?
Henry Hugh Gordon Stoker, always known as Dacre Stoker, was born in Dublin, Ireland in February 1885. His father was a doctor from one of Dublin's most prestigious families of doctors, lawyers and writers. His uncle was Bram Stoker, author of Dracula. Dacre Stoker entered the Royal Navy at Dartmouth, serving first on HMS Implacable in the Mediterranean, where he formed a lifelong friendship with Prince Louis of Battenberg. He was a keen sportsman, playing polo, cricket, football and tennis. He was socially popular and a self-confessed philanderer. Physically, Stoker was of slight build with angular features, lively eyes and with an ironic wit. He was also highly disciplined. He spoke beautifully and had a self-confident air of natural leadership. He was promoted sub-lieutenant in 1904, and after passing out from the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in Greenwich, volunteered for the new submarine service, a major incentive being the money, but also the possibility of high adventure. He served first on Holland-class submarines before promoted lieutenant and assigned to an A-class, next to B-class submarines. At 28, the already experienced Stoker applied to join the fledgling Australian Navy, which had purchased 2 of the newest and largest E-class submarines. Stoker was also a formidable submarine commander. That wicked sense of humour, which combined with steely determination to have a go, he was straight from central casting for the Australian ethos. C.J. Brodie, a fellow Dardanelles submarine officer, describes Stoker as the best of companions, with an eye like a hawk for a ball or a periscope. He would have been the choice of any board of generals, historians, or novelists for a dashing enterprise. More important, he would have been the choice of all of his own crew and his old messmates.
So, Greg, the newest Royal Australian Navy had 2 submarines, AE-1 and AE-2. What was to be their wartime role?
Well, the submarines left England in early 1914 and they arrived in Australia in May of that year. And of course, war breaks out in August, so they've only been in Australia a few months. The decision's made to capture German New Guinea. And so the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, naval reservists and soldiers are embarked in a troop ship and escorted by the Royal Australian Navy to take part in capturing the German seat of government, ribald, on the island of New Britain. The 2 submarines are also sent to take part in this activity. They sail north with 2 other ships, Protector and Upolu, the submarine depot ship Upolu, to look after them. But they're a little bit slow and they don't arrive in German New Guinea at Ribald until the 12th of September. All the fighting on land has taken place the day before. But the location of the German East Asian fleet under von Spee is unknown, and so there's concern that German warships might be in the area. So the submarines are used for patrol work in the New Britain area. And that's where, unfortunately, on the 14th of September 1914, AE-1 is lost during a diving incident.
Peter Briggs, in 2017, and following on from Greg's point there, we released an Australian naval history episode on the 1914 Ribald campaign, which listeners may wish to go back to. But can you briefly tell us the role of AE-1 and AE-2 in that operation?
Yes, they were used to guard the anchorage, as Greg says, against the possibility that the German cruisers would come upon it and attack the ships whilst they were landing and operating ashore. So they went out each day. AE-2 took the first patrol on the 13th and in company with the destroyer. On the 14th, AE-1 sailed with Parramatta. And as we now know, they separated at 2:30 in the afternoon. AE-1 to go back to Rabaul, but en route they took a practice dive and suffered a diving incident, which caused the submarine to lose control, go beyond its crush depth, and the submarine and its 35 crew now lie on the bottom off the Duke of York Islands.
Greg Swinden, with the capture of Ribald, followed soon after by the destruction of the German East Asia Squadron off the Falklands and the sinking of the Emden, indeed, by HMAS Sydney. What was the new strategic plan for the Australian fleet, including AE-2?
I'll need to backtrack a little bit there, Rob. Ribald's captured, German New Guinea becomes Australian territory. HMAS Australia operates in, that's the battle cruiser, the largest ship in the RAN at the time, operates in the Central and Eastern Pacific, searching for von Spee and his ships. They're always a little bit behind and they miss the Battle of the Falklands. But then Australia finds and sinks a German merchant ship that's been supporting von Spee and then goes on to England through the Atlantic to join the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron in the UK and work with the Royal Navy for the next 3 years. Sydney and Melbourne escorting the first AIF convoy across the Indian Ocean. As is well known, Sydney's sent to investigate a strange warship sighting at Cocos Island, which is found to be the Emden, and the Emden is destroyed in that action by the Sydney. Sydney and Melbourne continue to escort the first AIF to the Middle East, and then they proceed across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, which some might say is a nice place to be during the war. But the reason they were sent there is there are a number of neutral countries in the Caribbean area, particularly the United States that had not entered the war at that stage, and German merchant ships were holed up in various ports. and the Australian cruisers were part of a force that was to keep those German merchant ships contained in ports so they could not get back to Germany with their valuable cargoes, and also in the event that the Germans armed some of those ships and turned them into raiders, there'd be warships there to deal with them. They eventually, in late 1916, joined up with Australia in the North Sea. One of our other cruisers, Pioneer, was sent to operate off the coast of German East Africa with British forces, blockading the Refuge River, where Königsberg, which was a sister ship to Emden, was holed up, again to stop her getting out into the Indian Ocean and attacking our sea lines of communication. Generally, though, most of the Australian warships were being sent overseas. Australia was now becoming a backwater for the war, and AE-2, it was decided that it was far more valuable to have a modern E-class submarine in the Mediterranean, and so she sailed with the second OAF convoy to the Middle East in December of 1914, arriving in the Mediterranean in early 1915 and being attached then to the British Navy.
So Elizabeth Bletchley, AE-2 sails with the second AOF into the Mediterranean, and in your book you talk about Stoker's efforts to bring AE-2 into a theatre where she would likely see some action. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Stoker felt frustrated back in Sydney. He wanted to see action. He wrote to the Australian Naval Board arguing that AE-2 should accompany the 2nd Australian Expeditionary Force in the Middle East, then join the Royal Navy manoeuvres, as Greg has said. He wrote that he thought Britain might also help Australia replace its lost sub in return. With this argument, he gained permission to meet the Minister for the Defence, Senator George Pearce. Today, such a meeting would be impossible. Stoker travelled to Melbourne, where the fledgling federal government was temporarily based. The Defence Minister met Stoker behind the Speaker's chair in the then House of Representatives to negotiate the future deployment of AE-2. Stoker's daring pitch worked, and the Australian Naval Board cabled the Admiralty, offering AE-2 services. Amazingly, the AE-2 was the only warship to accompany the 2nd Expeditionary Forces convoy, which arrived in Suez on January 27, 1915. AE-2 had notched up 48,000 kilometres in under a year, a new record. In Egypt, the Admiralty ordered Stoker to join its forces gathering off the Dardanelles. The British War Council had previously decided on a naval expedition to bombard and take the Gallipoli Peninsula, with Constantinople as its objective.
Well, Greg, that brings us to the Dardanelles campaign. And in your book, First In, Last Out, you describe the Navy's involvement in that campaign. Can you outline the key features of the campaign and the Navy's role?
Well, the Navy was involved in a number of activities off the Dardanelles. Very early in the after the outbreak of war, 2 German warships, the Breslau and Goeben, had escaped from the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles and had joined up with the Ottoman Empire and became Ottoman Empire warships. So British warships were stationed off the entrance to the Dardanelles to prevent those 2 German, well, now Ottoman Empire warships breaking out into the Mediterranean and attacking shipping. There was also the activity where the plan was to send a number of British and French warships through the Dardanelles, break through and then threaten Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and try and force Turkey out of the war. There was an attack on the 18th of March of 1915, which unfortunately was a dismal failure due to the fact that the Turks had mined the Dardanelles, and several of those warships struck those mines and were unable to, and several of them sank, and then they retreated. They were unable to break through due to the minefields. The plan was then to sweep the minefields to allow the warships to go through. Minesweepers were sent through the Dardanelles, but of course they came under fire by Turkish shore batteries. In order to conduct the minesweeping, the shore batteries had to be destroyed, and which led on to the land campaign where the plan was to land troops, basically capture the Gallipoli Peninsula to take out or remove the threat of the shore batteries, allow the minesweepers to do their job, and then allow the warships to go through and threaten Constantinople. As we well know, that failed, but initially Gallipoli was a naval campaign or a maritime campaign to force Turkey out of the war. Once the Australian and British and French troops had landed, the Navy was there to basically get them in, provide the logistic support for them whilst they were there, and eventually when the evacuation occurred, to get them out. They also provided naval gunfire support for a number of the attacks that were going on. And even after the land campaign in Gallipoli had ended, the naval campaign continued on, basically firing at Turkish positions, getting the submarines, which I'm sure we've spoken about later, through the Dardanelles to attack Turkish shipping, but also most importantly to keep the Goeben and Breslau bottled up in the Sea of Marmara, and also a number of German U-boats that had made their way through there as well to keep them bottled up as well. So the Navy played a significant role across a wide range of activities during that Gallipoli campaign.
Well, Peter Briggs, Greg has talked briefly about putting submarines through the Dardanelles. How difficult would it have been to take a submarine through the Dardanelles, and how did the early attempts fare?
Very difficult. It's a challenging bit of navigation with strong currents sweeping through narrow channels and swirling around, so you get pushed left and right. Remember, the submarine, when it's dived, it can observe navigationally at periscope depth, which limits your range. But once it's deep, below periscope depth, it's completely blind, and it's relying on its compass and its log to figure out dead reckon where it is. The penetration was made much more difficult because of the lines of mines that were laid and very effectively turned back the surface ships on the 18th of March. So these had to be penetrated, and the minefields and the straits indeed were guarded by extensive fortifications and batteries of field artillery. So the surface was a very dangerous place to be. The French submarine Sofia attempted to penetrate the Dardanelles and was lost on the 5th of January 1915, and that was followed by E-15. On the 17th of April, the submarine was swept ashore. Commanding officer and 6 crewmen were killed, and the remainder were taken prisoners of war. And so it was against that backdrop that Stoker volunteered, indeed advocated, to be let to try a third attempt to get through the Dardanelles.
Following on from that, Peter, on the 25th of April 1915, the first Anzac Day, of course, Stoker did manage to get AE-2 through the Dardanelles defences. Now, as a submariner, what's your assessment of his achievement?
Quite brilliant. The Stoker had tried on the 24th, and they had a defect which forced him back. So the 25th was his second attempt. He was told to go in, because that was the morning of the landings, he was told to go in and create a diversion. So not only did he have this difficult navigation and minefield penetration to complete, now he had to attract attention to himself, removing, one of his major defences, which was the stealth. He was secondly told to attack potential Turkish mine layers up in the Narrows in case they were dropping floating mines, and these would drift down on the ships that may be used later in the day to bombard the shore. So Stoker had an extraordinarily difficult set of orders to comply with, and he set off on the surface with the intention of drawing attention to himself, dived once he was being attacked by artillery, having succeeded in the first job, got up into the Narrows, penetrated the minefields, going underneath the mines, but on 2 occasions he had to come up to periscope depth to take navigational observations. He had to come up through the mines, and he talks about 40 minutes of scraping wires. For 40 minutes, the scraping of wires was continuous, and from time to time something would catch forward and bump its way along the submarine till it floated off astern. These were mines. They were catching the wires, pulling the mines down on top of the submarine. Fortunately, the horns are all pointing up and the mines didn't detonate, but they calmly went on through the minefield. And when he comes back to periscope depth at the third occasion, he's through the minefield. He stays at periscope depth to see what's happening and to create the diversion. He spots a ship which he believes to be a mine layer, and as his periscope's being charged by several Ottoman destroyers, Stoker calmly fires a torpedo at the mine layer and is forced deep to avoid a collision. And here's the explosion of the torpedo once he's down at safe depth. The explosion shakes the submarine significantly. It's not very far away, and that upsets the gyro compass, which stops working. So Stoker is now in the middle of the Narrows with the whole area thoroughly alert without his primary heading source. He's got to rely on an unreliable magnetic compass. Nonetheless, he presses on. The submarine is swept aground underneath the guns of the fort, happily so close that the guns can't depress to hit him. Stoker calmly gets the submarine off the grounding and manoeuvres back into the centre of the strait and turns to continue up the strait, but runs aground even more heavily on the other side, again underneath the guns of the defending fort. On this occasion, he just drives ahead and drives bump the submarine over the sandbank into deeper water, damaging it as he does so the submarine starts to leak. He continues up the Narrows, attracting great attention, and comes across, unawares for him, but his periscope is sighted by a Turkish battleship that's just started bombarding the Anzac landing beaches by firing over the peninsula, forcing the landing ships further offshore and threatening the beaches. When Stoker turns up, the battleship packs up and leaves. And Stoker continues up the Narrows with one or two more observations until, with a flat battery, having extended all his dived endurance, he puts the submarine on the bottom to wait for dark to try and escape. Quite an extraordinary exploit as a submariner, just amazing. This would be a difficult task for a modern submarine with inertial navigation systems, GPS and sonars. Quite extraordinary for a submarine of the capability of AE-2 to press on against all these obstacles and to achieve the entry.
And Elizabeth, having got through to the Sea of Marmara, what success did AE-2 and Stoker have thereafter?
Oblivious of their role in the Gallipoli evacuation drama and the wireless message they didn't know had got through, the bruised and battered AE-2 enjoyed a short-lived sense of achievement in having entered the Sea of Marmara. On the 26th of April 1915, more daunting issues were to be faced. Primarily, AE-2's role was to try and prevent the passage of enemy troops and supplies to the Gallipoli Peninsula. The main problem was that AE-2 carried no guns and only a few torpedoes, described by Stoker as not the most modern type. On the first day in the Marmara, he sighted several columns of smoke ahead of approaching Turkish ships. Stoker aimed at one of these ships, but his torpedo either narrowly missed or the ship's shallow draft saved her. Stoker then turned to a popular pastime for the AE-2 and future Allied submarines, scaring Turkish fishermen. He sailed up to a flotilla of small boats, causing them to panic and scatter. The action succeeded in causing just that effect, but by nightfall Turkish patrol boats were closing in and AE-2 was forced to dive. Six Turkish craft had indeed been detailed to harass the submarine, which they continued to do. One Turkish warship moved so close to AE-2 on the surface, it narrowly avoided a hit on its conning tower. Next day was calmer. A transport came into view heading for Gallipoli with 2 guarding destroyers. Stoker fired the second last of his torpedoes, but disaster struck. The torpedo rose quietly and puffed to the surface and lay motionless. Its engine had failed to start. Faulty torpedoes were common in E-class submarines of the time. Disappointed, Stoker took AE-2 under 18 metres so that the crew could rest. Next morning, Stoker took the submarine up to the centre of the Sea of Marmara to get a closer look at the entrance to Istanbul. His plan was to launch an attack the next day. Returning towards Gallipoli, Stoker tried several tricks to convince the Turks that more Allied subs were present. He dived under and turned and rose and up the periscope to sail back again into the Marmara, confusing the Turkish ships. The next recorded starboard torpedo strike by AE-2 was made the same day on a Turkish gunboat. Conflicting reports mention a possible hit. Later on the surface and heading back towards Istanbul, AE-2 spotted the periscope of an approaching submarine. It was the E-14. Stoker and AE-2 had by this stage been solo in the Marmara for 5 days. Lieutenant Commander Boyle of E-14 had been ordered to follow AE-2 immediately AE-2 signal had been received on the 25th of April. The 2 captains conferred. Boyle was the senior officer. He refused to give Stoker any of his torpedoes, dissuaded Stoker in proceeding with his plan to attack Istanbul, and ordered Stoker to rendezvous with E-14 at the same spot the next day at 10 a.m. It was a fateful decision. Returning as ordered the next day, AE-2 ran into a Turkish torpedo boat, the Sultan Hisar. Diving to avoid the gunboat, AE-2 malfunctioned and instead rose, dived again, out of control, then rose again. It was a terrifying nightmare. AE-2 was defenceless. It carried no guns and was in no position to fire its remaining torpedo. AE-2 could not submerge. The crew leapt overboard and tanks were flooded. Stoker was the last to leave the sinking sub. All hands were taken aboard the Sultan Hisar. AE-2's success in the Sea of Marmara was twofold. Stoker followed his instructions to run amok, creating panic, chaos and delays among Turkish supply vessels heading for Gallipoli. Secondly, it forced the Turks to stop sending reinforcements and supplies by sea as they feared the loss of shipping. Instead, they sent men and supplies by land, causing costly delays. Finally, AE-2's success in reaching the Sea of Marmara led to the following deployment of other British submarines, including the E-14. The Australian submarine had made history.
Peter, I'm going to ask you in a minute about those other submarines, but before I do, Greg, can I ask you, Elizabeth mentioned a wireless message. Can you talk a little about that?
Yes, it's probably the wireless message that may have been heard around the world. Once AE-2 had got through the Dardanelles, they surfaced and Stoker got his telegraphist William Falconer, one of the Australians of the crew. The crew was 50-50 British and Australian, to rig the wireless equipment and send the signal back to the Royal Navy that they had broken through the Dardanelles. That signal was sent. They attempted to get a confirmation signal that it had been received, but they kept sending it, not knowing that it had in fact been received, and received at a vital time during the Gallipoli campaign. The Anzacs had been landed and fighting had been quite hard on that first day. They'd penetrated probably 1,000 metres inland and were facing very difficult countryside and pretty difficult defence from the Turkish soldiers on the Gallipoli Peninsula. There were a number of casualties. They were disorganised. They were facing resilient troops defending their homeland. And it was strongly recommended by the senior officers ashore that they be evacuated. At this time, a conference was going on board the major British battleship where General Ian Hamilton, in charge of the entire land campaign, was discussing the possibility of evacuating the Anzacs from their landing places. And at that point, the signal from AE-2 arrives. Hamilton reads the signal and makes the decision that there will be no evacuation, despite the fact that many of his senior officers were strongly recommending that that take place. Hamilton then sends a signal to General Birdwood, who's commanding the Australians and New Zealanders ashore, saying that you've got through the difficult part, now you just need to dig until you are safe. So basically, if AE-2 had not got through the Dardanelles, if the signal that telegraphist Falconer had sent had not been reached, it most likely would have been that the Gallipoli campaign would have been 3 days. They would have evacuated the troops and have not stayed for the 8 months. So it was a very, very important signal arriving just at the right time for a decision to be made. Whether that was the right decision is not for me to say.
Peter Briggs, as Elizabeth also mentioned, other submarines did try to emulate AE-2's entry into the Sea of Marmara. Did they have any more luck?
Yes, but of course, the submarines that followed were not told to run amok in the Narrows. They were able to keep out of sight and do the penetration. They just had to concentrate on the navigation rather than trying to draw attention to themselves and to attack shipping in the Narrows. So they had a significantly easier task, and they had one which they knew had been achieved by AE-2. The 10 submarines managed to get into the Sea of Marmara, including AE-2 and E-14, as we've heard. E-14 and E-11 were very successful. Submarines were fitted with a light gun, and that was very useful against small craft. And at the end of the campaign, 10 submarines had penetrated the Narrows, operated in the Sea of Marmara, had destroyed 242 Ottoman ships, many of them quite small, but nonetheless important in ferrying supplies. And 7 of the 18 submarines that were involved in the attempt, 7 had been lost. So it was not an inexpensive campaign, but it had a significant impact, as Elizabeth has said, forcing the Ottoman reinforcements to travel by land. They arrived much later than if they'd been sitting on a ship, far more tired, of course. And there are some daring accounts of submarines with guns attacking trains, which is an interesting, with their gun, of course, interesting to imagine. So it was the first submarine campaign, and quite an innovative one in developing new tactics and new weapons for the submarines.
Elizabeth Bletchley, Stoker and his crew were then taken into captivity. Can you talk a little bit about what happened to them then?
After sinking the AE-2, all crew were picked up by Turkish Captain Risa of the gunboat Sultan Hisar. Dripping wet, they were taken as prisoners of war to Istanbul. There they were given dry old Turkish uniforms and paraded derisively through the streets. Stoker was the main target. He was under interrogation soon after, alternatively threatened and cajoled for hours for information, which he did not reveal. The crew was then moved by rail to Afyon Karahisar in central Turkey, a remote inland rail junction recently cleansed of its Armenian population. Stoker described the conditions as indescribable filth with no facilities. The crew slept, ate and sat in huts with a bare floor in freezing conditions. He called the camp living hell, full of vermin and rats. There was no news of Gallipoli or the withdrawal. Officers and men were then separated. The crew were put to work as labourers on road making. All were underfed. After 5 months, Stoker and Lieutenant Geoffrey Fitzgerald of HMAS AE-2 were offered as exchange prisoners, probably through Vatican influence, thinking that being Irish, both were Catholics. Still confined to a cell, they were pumped for information. Fitzgerald, a Catholic, was released in exchange for Turkish POWs, but Stoker, because he was Protestant, was quickly returned to prison. Stoker was determined to escape, and together with Captain Archibald Cochrane of the E7 and Lieutenant Price of the E7, hatched a plan. They spent 11 days on the run in mountainous and uninhabited country and were starving and hallucinating when they were recaptured and sent into solitary confinement for 5 months. Stoker was then sent to a POW camp at Yozgat, deep in Asia Minor. Lieutenant Price died there. By the end of 1915, nearly all the AE-2 crew were shipped first to Kankeri, an agricultural centre close to Ankara, then on to Belemedic, a forced labour camp in the remote Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey. Belemedic was the main construction camp for the German Berlin to Baghdad railway, being built for the supply of Middle Eastern oil and military supplies for the Turks and Germans. It was a terrible place, in such inhospitable terrain that no fences were necessary. The men froze in winter snow and collapsed with malaria, dysentery and meningitis in summer. 4 of the AE-2 men died there. The survivors were walking skeletons by 1918. The AE-2 men survived 3.5 years of appalling conditions. One reason that they survived was that they were mostly young, fit men, useful to the Germans as trained technicians, and because they were a bonded group of disciplined men who were able to some degree to look out for each other. In Yozgat, Stoker, with his optimism and humour, turned his talents into morale raising among his mixed bag of fellow officers. He wrote plays, devised musical evenings, acted, directed and produced plays, in evenings of entertainment as well as sporting events.
Well, Greg Swinden, it's also important that we mention some of the other crew members of AE-2 and their service both in the submarine and then in captivity. Who might we talk about?
Well, Elizabeth mentioned that 4 of the AE-2 personnel died during captivity building the railway. Shades of World War II, with another number of Australians dying building a railway. 4 of those men who died, Chief Petty Officer Varco was the first to die. He died from meningitis, and he was the senior sailor in AE-2 and a father figure to many of the younger men. So his death was a great loss to their organisation. 2 more men died from typhus. That was Petty Officer Gilbert and Able Seaman Knaggs. Knaggs actually wrote an extensive diary of his time as a POW, which is now at the Australian War Memorial. So he managed to survive even though he didn't. The saddest of the deaths, though, was Stoker Michael Williams, born in Dunkeld down near Hamilton in Victoria. He was from a large Catholic family, had 4 sons. All 4 sons died during the war. One was killed at Gallipoli. Bill Williams died from malaria, although there are some theories that he may have been amongst a bunch of POWs who were so badly sick that they were done away with by Turks, but that could not be proven, although his body was never recovered at the end of the war. And his other 2 brothers died in France in 1917 and 1918. So that was quite sad, 4 family members dying during the war. Stoker managed to escape a couple of times, but basically had to give himself up when they were basically out of food. A couple of the other AE-2 men also escaped. John Wheat escaped twice On the first occasion, he took Alexander Nicholas, Nichols from AE-2 with him, and the second time he took Stoker Cullen. They were on the run for nearly 3 weeks on both their escapes. They had to give themselves up when they basically ran out of food, and also, being white men in the Middle East, they stood out, and they didn't speak any of the Ottoman language. But they did try to make an escape attempt to get to the western coast of Turkey in order to steal a boat and try and get out to the Greek islands. So we lost 4 men from AE-2. 3 of those men are now buried, oddly enough, in the North Gate Cemetery in Baghdad at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery there. Originally they were buried at Bellemetic. Poor old Bill Williams, his body was never recovered at the end of the war, and there's a special memorial for him at the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Baghdad as well.
Well, Peter Briggs, from talking about the ship's company of AE-2, how about AE-2 herself? Was the wreck of AE-2 ever relocated?
Yes. The wreck was relocated by a Turkish maritime archaeologist and wreck hunter, Selçuk Kolay, and subsequent to that, examined, confirmed it was AE-2, 1988, I think, Elizabeth, and we then formed the AE-2 Commemorative Foundation and raised, by sponsorship and Commonwealth grant, the money to undertake a survey of AE-2 in 2008 and to follow that up in 2014 with a complete external survey and the internal examination using remotely operated vehicles with cameras, which examined the forward half of AE-2, fitted a lockable hatch so that it's not that vulnerable to plunder, and a protective navigation buoy was laid over the top of it, and most importantly, we added a cathodic protection system which will preserve the submarine. It's sitting on the bottom at 73 metres, where it was sunk by Sultan Hisar in 1915.
Well, Peter, as a follow-on question, is that sort of the end of the story with how AE-2 should be preserved? Is there anything else we need to do?
Well, I think it's worth reflecting on what we've just gone through. This 800-tonne submarine with a crew of 32 achieved some quite dramatic strategic impacts. It diverted attention on the morning of the landings, so it gave some breathing time for the Anzacs scaling the heights. It forced the battleship about to bombard the beaches to move away. The signal had a major impact on the course of their campaign, and indeed we could say set the scene for the Anzac legend. In the Sea of Marmara, Stoker was quite effective in disrupting the critical transport of troops in this first few days. So without Stoker being in there in AE-2, there would have been far more Ottoman troops to throw back the Anzacs. And finally, he initiates a campaign which in the end sinks over 240 Ottoman ships and really disrupts the resupply by sea. So AE-2 is very symbolic, and I think it's a key, it's a touchstone that future generations should have the opportunity to enjoy and reflect on. The preservation via the cathodic protection system will mean that it could still be there in 100 years in good order, provided we continue to replace those anodes every 10 to 12 years. And that's a current campaign that we are endeavouring to mount.
So finally, Elizabeth Bletchley, the name Stoker, of course, will always be linked with AE-2, but can you tell us a bit about what he went on to do after World War I?
Post-war, Stoker returned to the Royal Navy in 1919 on half pay. In December that year, he learned he had been appointed captain of HMS Royal Arthur, the depot ship for the Atlantic submarine flotilla. However, Stoker had doubts about his naval future. He took 6 months' leave on half pay and signed an acting contract with director Norman McKinnell of the Royal Theatre. In October 1920, he asked the Admiralty to put him on the retired list. On leaving the Navy, he ditched his pseudonym of Hugh Gordon in compliance with naval wishes and appeared as H.G. Stoker in his first London play, A Social Conscience. He quickly carved out a niche, playing character roles as officers, a doctor, and even Watson to Sherlock Holmes. In the play, The 11th Commandment, he met the beautiful actress Dorothy Pidcock Pegg, whom he later married. They were happy together for 41 years. Stoker had to divorce his first wife, Olive, in 1919. She had had a child with a lover while Stoker was a POW. In the mid-1920s, Stoker's career blossomed, and he wrote his best-selling book, Straws in the Wind, about AE-2, with excellent reviews. Visiting New York in 1922, playing in John Galsworthy's Loyalties, the local press seized on his naval career and the story of AE-2. Loyalties was a New York hit and Stoker a celebrity. Back in London in 1928, Stoker launched into his most famous role as a colonel in H.G. Sheriff's Journey's End. It was a huge success, with critical acclaim for Stoker, and Laurence Olivier was also in the cast. One evening, all Britain's VCs attended, a nod by them to Stoker, whom they thought should have also been awarded the honour. In 1932, Stoker co-wrote a successful West End play, Below the Surface, based on the AE-2 story. Throughout the 1930s, Stoker spread his talents to other media. In 1932, he made his first BBC radio broadcast of the play Hazard, about AE-2, and then The Fourth Man, about his escape attempt. His first film appearance was Channel Crossing, 1933, then Brown on Resolution, 1935, with Sir John Mills. Renamed Forever England, it is still shown on Australian TV around Anzac Day. He made 8 films in all. His second career reached a pinnacle in the 1930s. He became manager of the Repertory Players and in 1938 manager of the Apollo Theatre. In 1939, Stoker was recalled to active service at the age of 54. The Navy appointed him commander of HMAS Minos, the naval base at Lowestoft, which was the minesweeper and gunboat operations base against the Germans in the North Sea. Lowestoft was heavily bombed during the war, and by 1942, after 2 years' service, he was exhausted, but the Admiralty still wanted him as a media advisor. In 1944, he was appointed to the staff of Navy Command for the Allied Expeditionary Force for the Invasion of Europe, ANCXE. The 59-year-old Stoker was present at one of the most momentous meetings of World War II, the May 15, 1944 final conference of military chiefs to approve Neptune, code for the Navy's landing the huge Allied army for Overlord, the invasion of Europe. Present with Stoker were all the great names: Eisenhower, Montgomery, Churchill, and King George VI. After D-Day, Stoker returned to the fleet to brief officers and crew on the upcoming operations against the Japanese in the Pacific. Still not ready to retire, Stoker returned to civilian life eventually in new West End plays and co-wrote another escape drama at the Adelphi Theatre, Morning Departure. It was made later into a film starring Sir John Mills. TV was next. He co-wrote a TV drama called Deep Water, a psychological thriller, which one reviewer called First Class TV. Stoker worked in TV and for the BBC until the late 1950s. Dacre Stoker died in February 1966 in London, aged 81.
So before we conclude, may I ask each of you if you have any final thoughts? Greg, let me go to you first.
AE-2 has a place in Australian history forever. But also AE-2 and AE-1 were our first submarines, wise decisions by senior officers in those days, and that created the submarine history for the RAN. They were lost, but then we got the J class at the end of the war given to us by the British. Then we had the O class during the mid-1920s, early 1930s, followed by the Oberon class, now followed by the Collins class, to be followed in the future by the Attack class. So AE-1 and AE-2 set the standard and created that need for submarines for the RAN.
And Peter Briggs, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, this is an extraordinary story. Stoker and AE-2, and the two go together. Stoker drives the agenda. Stoker goes to Melbourne to see the Minister of Defence, gets the submarine, permission for the submarine to go back to the Mediterranean. It's Stoker who writes the plan to penetrate the Dardanelles and then goes ahead and does it after two other submarines have been sunk. It's Stoker who creates an AE-2, create the diversion, drive off the battleship, send that fateful signal, operate in the Sea of Marmara and holding up Turkish reinforcements, and initiate the submarine campaign that sinks 242 ships. This is a marvellous story and one that Australia and its Navy should celebrate.
Thanks, Peter. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for. My thanks to Elizabeth Bletchley, Peter Briggs and Greg Swinden. Thank you for joining us, and for more information on the Australian Naval History podcast series, simply search for Naval Studies Group in your search engine. Goodbye for now.